Welcome back everyone to part 5 of our Smart Enemy AI series. And in this part I'm going to show you how to create different enemy types. So we're going to be creating this ranged enemy that has a rifle, goes around the player, attacks the player by shooting their rifle and doing a trace. And I'm also going to show you how to make sure that the enemy is always within sight, so that if I go out of sight, the enemy runs to find a place where they can see me and then attack me again. And I'm also going to show you how to damage the enemy. So I'm going to damage the enemy a few times. After the enemy's damaged a few times, they go and hide and they heal. And after they heal, they come out to attack me again. Let me show you that again. I'm going to damage the enemy. They go and hide, heal for a bit. After healing, come out and attack again. Now I'm also going to show you how you can get two enemies to fight each other, like this. So now we have melee enemy versus ranged enemy. And yeah, could be anyone's fight. I don't know who's going to win. Alright, so let's get started. Alright, so this is where we left off last time. We have a behavior tree for our enemy with an attack sequence and a cooldown of 10 seconds. Let me actually change this to 5 seconds. I think 10 is a lot. We have a strafe sequence and we have a find cover sequence. And this is what it looked like. The enemy can strafe around the player. The enemy will then go to attack once the cooldown's over and then continue to strafe. And if I disconnect the strafe and attack and just connect the find cover, the enemy before attacking will go find cover, wait there for a few seconds, and then come out to attack the player before going to hide again. Let me put these back for the strafe and the attack. And also one small issue I noticed when I restart the engine, sometimes this happens, specifically on the move to ideal range task. Whenever I restart the engine, I find that the ideal range and attack target blackboard keys have reset to be self-actor. So if you see this, make sure to set them to the right values. And I fixed it for myself to stop happening by just going to the task itself and renaming the attack target and then renaming it back. I don't know why. I think it's a bug with the engine, but just make sure that all the values are set correctly when you restart your project. All right, so what are we going to be doing this time? Well, everything we've been doing so far has been on this base enemy class. So we're going to now create a ranged enemy class and a melee enemy class. We're going to be creating two different behaviors for them, two different actors for them, different weapons, and so on. And we're going to be using the tasks, the behavior tree tasks that we've created so far, the behavior tree decorators, and adding some more to create this ranged functionality. But before we dive into it, let me show you some of the content that I'll be using to make this happen. Two things, actually. I'm using some sounds and the rifle from the Lyra starter game. And I'm also using one muzzle effect from Paragon Sparrow. These are both free to use on the asset store, but I did make some tweaks to them. And also I got some animations from Mixamo. So I have this, and I created a blend space out of them. So I have this rifle blend space with an idle animation holding a rifle, walk forward, jog forward, left and right, and backwards. These 6 animations plus their walks variation. And also we have this rifle fire animation, which we'll be creating a montage out of whenever the enemy fires a rifle. Now, I downloaded these from Mixamo and retargeted to the UE5 mannequin, but as always, I'm going to leave all of the assets free to download for my patrons and link down in the description. One more thing, so to show you the actual, if I go to my weapons folder, now I added this meshes for the rifle. This is the rifle that we'll be using. It's the same one I got from Lyra, I just changed the color a bit. And this is, so So if I go back to content, I also have this audio folder, which has this rifle fire sound, which is just a cue that combines both these sounds. And I'm going to be showing you how to add the effects and the sounds within the animation montage itself. All right, so let's get started. First thing we want to do is actually take our enemy base, right-click, and create a child blueprint class from it. And we're going to call this the BP enemy ranged. Now, I want them to look a bit different. So right now, all the enemies look the same. So one thing I've also went ahead and done is, if I go back to my contents folder, I have this materials, and I copied the materials that come with the Mani mesh, these two materials, and I've created a new instance of them that's just orange or a different color. You can edit the color by just changing this tint value in the material. So I'm going to apply this to Mani, so our ranged Mani, so it would have a different color and look like this. So now we can differentiate between the ranged and the melee or whatever we create. Also, one thing we want to do is now all of them are using the same animation blueprint. We don't want that, so we want to create a new animation blueprint for our ranged enemy, because if we just pile everything in the same animation blueprint with conditions, if ranged, if melee, it's going to get really complicated. So better create a different one for them. So I'm just going to copy over this ABP Mani, and create a new ABP Mani ranged. All right, let's open it up and see what needs to change here. Everything in the event graph will remain the same. I'm going to open the anim graph though. We're going to be using all custom animations, so I'm going to disable this control rig for the foot IK, so it won't interfere with our animations. So I'm just going to go here, make float. I can just type 0 here, but I want to make it very clear and also add a comment that I am disabling foot IK. Maybe even make it red, just to be very clear. All right, now let's go into our locomotion and our idle state. We won't be using any of this. Oh, and actually in the event graph, we don't really need this is focusing target variable anymore. We're not going to be using it. I'm going to keep it for now. Maybe we'll need it later, but we're not going to be using it now because we're always playing the same animations, whether we're focusing or not focusing the target. So where's my rifle idle? Yeah, here it is. So plug this one in. This is going to be our idle state. And for our walk run, we again don't need to blend by bool anymore. Where is my blend space? Yeah, so we're just going to create this blend space rifle that I just showed you. And we're going to plug in the direction and speed. All right. I actually don't need to change anything else for the animation blueprint, but let's go back to our BP enemy ranged class and make sure to select the ABP Mani ranged from here. All right, great. Now, one thing, of course, we have to do is that you'll notice we don't have a rifle equipped. So let's go to our skeletal mesh. So I'm going to go over here on mesh, double click this mesh for SKM Mani simple. And we want to add a rifle socket, just like we did with the sword socket. So if you search for socket here, so we have this hand underscore R sword socket. So if you right click on the hand, the right hand, let's add a new socket and let's call this hand underscore R rifle socket. Great. Now let's go to our preview scene, use specific animation, and let's use our rifle idle aim. And right-click on the rifle and add preview assets and search for our rifle static mesh. Now we need to transform this to look like the, well, to be in a correct position. And not to bore you with annoying transforms, I already tried this and I have the values, so I'm just gonna plug them in right here. Alright, so I plugged in these values you see here, and this looks alright. So it doesn't have to be perfect, but it looks like he's holding the rifle nicely and looking through the scope. Alright, so one more thing we want to do is let's go to our animations folder and let's create a montage out of this rifle fire. So right click here and create anim montage. I'm gonna call it montage rifle fire. And let's open it up. We're holding our rifle and this is what the animation looks like. Now we're gonna do a few things here. First thing is we want to add an anim notify, or a montage notify when the actual firing of the weapon happens. So this is going to tell us in the blueprint when to actually trigger a trace or a damage event or whatever. So when do we actually fire the weapon? I can look at the finger and see when it gets pulled. Yeah, so right around here maybe. So I'm gonna go over to the notifies, and on this one I'm gonna right click, add notify, and select montage notify. And I'm gonna call this one fire. Now we also want to add sounds and effects directly into the montage. So we can add them to the same track, but it's gonna get messy, so I'm gonna create 2 new tracks. So add a notify track, I'll call this one sounds, and add a notify track, I'll call this one effects. So for sounds, let's right click, make sure you're hovering over the right track, add notify and play sound, probably around the same time as the fire. And the sound we have here is our rifle fire cue that I just showed you. So now if you play this, now it looks like the actual rifle is firing with a nice sound. Final thing we need to do is add an effect. So also around this same time, let me just make it slightly this, yeah. Around the same time, we're going to add a notify and we want to play particle effect. Now, if you have a Niagara effect, choose Niagara particle effect, but I have just a regular legacy system particle effect. And this one is called the Sparrow primary muzzle flash. All right. Now, by default, this is going to play somewhere, yeah, at the bottom, at the root node here on the feet. So what I'm going to do actually is, so that it doesn't play, spawn on the root, I'm going to attach it to this rifle socket that we created. So now it is going to play, yeah, right on the socket itself, but we want it to be in front of the weapon. So let's change the location rotation a bit. So maybe on the y-axis, change it to be 50. Let's see how that looks now. Yes, okay, that's nice. But the explosion is actually happening to the right. So I need to rotate this 90 degrees on the z-axis. How does it look like now? Very nice. All right, and you can actually scale it to be a bit bigger. So maybe 1.5 on all axes. All right, that's looking like a really nice montage now. Great. So, now that we have our fire montage, we have our animation blueprint set up, and we also have the new actor for our ranged enemy. We need to make some changes in our base enemy class now. Let me show you what needs to happen. I'm gonna close this. So if we open up our BP enemy base, what we had here is a wield sword event and a sheath sword event. Now these are very specific to a sword, and they don't really belong in a base enemy class. And we want something for the ranged enemy as well to wield the rifle. So instead of having sheath sword, wield rifle, wield sword, we're just going to create a wield weapon or equip weapon and unequip weapon event. And since these are all common for every enemy AI, let's add them to our enemy AI interface. So in the AI folder, open up BPI enemy AI, and this is where we add all the functions that are common for all of our AIs. And we're going to add 2 new functions. The first one is going to be called equip weapon, and the second one is going to be called unequip weapon. All right, so if we compile and save this, now back here in our enemy base, instead of wield swords, let's just use the equip. Well, actually, just to make sure it's there, if you open up interfaces here, you can double click on them and they'll be added for you. So instead of wield swords, we want equip weapon. So change that. And instead of sheath swords, let's call it, let's call the unequip weapon. We'll also want to rename the wield sword and on sheath sword event dispatchers to make them more generic for any type of weapon. So let's rename this to on weapon equipped, and this one on weapon unequipped, and then everything else will stay the same. Great. Let's also, before we forget, let's rename the blueprint tasks, the behavior tree tasks. So in our tasks folder, we have, where is it? Sheath sword and wield sword. Let's call this one BTT unequip weapon. And we'll call this one BTT equip weapon. And just open them up to make sure we're calling, okay, compile first the enemy base and go back here. You might find an error, so make sure to replace wield sword here with equip weapon. And you can just plug in your pawn that's cast. Now, of course, we don't need a cast here because now it's in the interface. We can just call the equip weapon as a message. And then if the pawn doesn't implement the interface, nothing will happen. But we already need to cast anyway to bind on weapon equipped. So it doesn't really matter at this point. So I'm just going to keep the cast. And let's open up the unequip weapon task as well and make sure that we are calling unequip weapon. And the event dispatchers were renamed correctly here. All right, so now we have the setup done. So now we need to actually be able to equip and unequip any type of weapon. So a sword for the melee enemy, a rifle for the ranged, and so on. So we need to make some changes here. Now we are actually calling the this variable is wielding sword to tell us if we're wielding a sword or not. And this actor, we store it in a variable called stored actor. So let's rename this. This is in our base enemy, by the way. So let's rename these to be more general for any weapon. So since this is the base enemy, these should apply for any type of enemy. So we're going to call this is wielding weapon in general. And this sword actor, let's call it weapon actor. Oh, forgot the R. Weapon actor. And we actually need to create now our different types of weapons. So if I go to content and open my weapons folder, let's take this BP weapon sword and change it to BP weapon base. So we're going to have also a base weapon class and 2 children, a sword and a rifle. So open up the base weapon. Let's make it more general. Instead of sword mesh, let's just call it mesh. And actually remove the sword because, yeah, for the base weapon, we don't want to assign any mesh yet. So now if I close this and go back to my enemy, you'll see that now this has changed to weapon base, and now we're spawning weapon base and so on. So let's open up our content browser again and right click on our weapon base and say create child blueprint class. And we will create our weapon sword. Actually, I don't know if this is gonna stay, this thumbnail is gonna stay a sword or it's going to, if I compile, no, it's still, yeah, it's gonna be confusing. Maybe when I restart, it'll be gone. Anyway, so let's open up our sword and then add our sword mesh here. All right. And this one, if I change it to like, I don't know, this cube or something, yeah, it's gonna change here. And if I remove it, yeah, it stays. This is fine. Okay, I'll keep it like this. So now we have a sword weapon as well, that is a child of the base weapon. So back here in our base enemy, instead of spawning the base weapon, we can now spawn the sword. And it's fine that we're assigning the sword to this, well, what happened to this variable? To this weapon actor. Because this weapon actor is of type weapon base, and the sword is a child of that, so they can be assigned to the same variable. And now we want to create another child of this weapon base and call this weapon rifle. Open it up. In our mesh, I'm going to select my rifle static mesh right here. Excellent. All right. So now in our ranged enemy, on begin play, we want to spawn our rifle immediately. I don't want there to be an animation for equipping and unequipping the rifle. I just want the ranged enemy to always be carrying it. So let's go over to our equip weapon here in our interface, which we just added, and then spawn actor from class, and let's choose our rifle. And let's set our weapon actor. So we're setting the variable, again, this weapon actor, which is of type weapon base. And the same as we did here, where we attached this actor to this socket, we want to do the same as well for our ranged enemy. So we're going to take this weapon actor and attach it to our mesh. But now instead of this socket name, we had a new socket called hand_r rifle_socket. And after setting is wielding weapon, let's immediately call on weapon equipped or dispatch this event. Now, I don't think we're going to be needing this event now, but it's good to just dispatch it. And I don't need any of these two, I'll move them. And immediately on begin play, let's call our equip weapon. Now you can call it from the function, which is within this class, or you can call it from the interface. But since we're within the same class, let's call it call the function from the class that we're in. Now if I compile, oh, I have to add a transform. So you can just pull off of here and say make transform. Now this value again is irrelevant because when we attach it to our mesh, we override the transform, but we need to have a default value here anyway. And I have an error because I didn't compile the base enemy. Now I can compile the range and the errors are gone. All right. So now I want to see what our ranged enemy looks like in the world. So let's go over to our content browser, take our ranged enemy and drop him in the world. Oh, let's delete this one. And this is what our enemy looks like in the world. And just be aware, we're currently running the melee behavior tree or the base behavior tree on this enemy, which is going to cause problems. So I'm just going to unhook the root just for now. to see what it looks like. Make sure that our spawning weapon is working correctly. Nice. Yeah, so now as soon as the enemy begins play, he spawns the weapon in the right socket, and it looks good. Great. Now, before we move on to creating separate behavior trees for each enemy type, let's actually create a melee enemy, because right now all of the melee enemy functionality is within this enemy base, but they technically should be within a melee enemy. So I'm going to right-click again on our BP enemy base, create a child, and call this BP enemy melee. And I'm going to pretty much copy all of this here, or actually not copy it, I'm going to cut it because we don't want the base enemy to have any of these. And then open up our melee enemy, and I'm going to paste all of this here. Why can't I paste? Oh, let me go back, copy, and melee, paste. Okay, yeah, there we go. So now we have our equip swords and our unequip swords, just to make sure. Yeah, this is swords. And now we have all of these in our melee enemy and not our base enemy. And our base enemy just won't do anything because it's not an actual enemy type. It's just the parent class that all the other enemies will inherit from. Now, one thing I also want to do, which is just yeah, for good practice, we added the equip weapon and unequip weapon in our blueprint interface, but we didn't add the attack function. So let's go ahead and do that as well. So over here in our BPI enemy AI, let's add a function and call it attack or default attack, whatever. And then over here in our melee enemy, let's replace this with, compile, with our attack function. Great. Compile and save. Now also in our ranged enemy, I'm going to delete these two. In our ranged enemy, we're probably also going to want to implement a separate attack function, but let's leave it empty for now. We're going to get to this in a bit. All right, so let's talk about behavior trees and how we can inherit or create sort of a base behavior tree. Now, all of our enemies now, the base enemy, the melee enemy, the ranged enemy, only have a single behavior tree. And you can't really create child behavior trees from a parent one the same way that we do with like the base enemy and the base weapon, and we inherit from it. You can't really do that with the behavior tree. But what you can do is create subtrees within a larger behavior tree. Let me show you what I mean. This investigating state, for example, is common for pretty much all of our enemy types. So I want this to be reused. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over here in our AI folder, and I'm going to create a new folder and call this behavior trees. And I'm going to move both my behavior tree and my blackboard inside this folder. And I'm going to create a new behavior tree. And I'm going to call this bt underscore subtree underscore investigating. And I'm just going to copy this investigation sequence right here. Open up this new tree, make a sequence node, and just paste all of these nodes. So this was exactly our investigation state, right? So now in my base, my BT enemy base, instead of running all of these, what I can do is say run behavior. And I'm just going to move this blackboard, this decorator to this one as well. And now run behavior takes a behavior tree to run. So I can say run the investigating behavior tree. Right, and we're just going to call this investigating states. Right, so now if you open this, you'll see that this is your subtree. So this is how you can actually extend your behavior trees to be a bit more manageable. Otherwise they get really large. So now I can have trees inside trees inside trees and so on. All right, so let's look at our passive state. Now, our passive state, this isn't really common for all the enemy types because this one includes wielding a weapon. But for example, in our ranged enemy, we're always going to be equipping the sword. We don't want an unequipped weapon. So only this part will be common for pretty much all passive states. So I'm going to copy this. And I'm going to create a new behavior tree. Search for behavior tree, and I'm going to call it BT subtree underscore passive. Open it up. So this was a selector node. So we're going to copy this and plug it into the root. And if you recall, what this does is just it checks. Do we have a patrol route? Then patrol. Otherwise, just clear focus and wait, or just stand still. And that's going to be our passive state. So back here in our BT enemy base, I can delete all of this and say run behavior and choose our passive tree. And I'm going to call this the passive state. Or patrol or passive states, something like that. And then this is only for the melee behavior tree. All right, so now I can create trees for the ranged and tree for the melee. So I'm going to duplicate this BT enemy base and create one, call it BT enemy melee. Open it up. So we said that all of this is common for our melee enemy, right? Because this is what we initially created for our melee enemy. So I'm not going to change anything here, but I am going to change the base. So in our base, we don't really need this anymore. We don't need this selector. We just need this passive state. Again, we're not really going to be running the base behavior tree anywhere. We're going to be running either the melee one or the range one, but it's good to have a base tree sort of to show us the structure. And in our base tree, we don't have actually a combat state at all because, yeah, combat isn't really common. So I'm just going to leave it here. And I'm going to delete this find cover as well. So this is like our basic common behavior tree that we can copy and paste and then add to it. All right, so now I can copy this base tree again and create one for BT enemy ranged. All right, now let me move this a bit. Now our ranged enemy is definitely going to have a combat state, and we're going to do a lot here. But before we dive into it, I just created a whole bunch of trees right now. Let me actually create a folder here and call it subtrees and move the investigating and passive to it. And I'm gonna just tidy things up. Let's close everything here except our two enemy types. All right. So if you recall, over here in our enemy, if you search for AI controller, we are running the same AI controller class for all of our enemy types. And if I search for this AI controller and open it up, you'll see that the first thing we do on possess is run a behavior tree. But this behavior tree is not a variable. We're always running the same behavior tree every time. Now we want to run a different behavior tree depending on the enemy type. So we want to run the melee behavior tree for the melee enemy, and we want to run the ranged behavior tree for the ranged enemy. Now, how do we actually do that? Well, who knows which behavior tree to run? That is our pawn class. So I'm going to, in the enemy base here, add another variable and call it behavior tree. And this is going to be of type behavior tree, object reference. Compile and save. Now for the base enemy, let's just give this a default value of our BT enemy base. For our melee enemy, let's open it up. Behavior tree, let's choose our BT enemy melee. And for our range, behavior tree, and choose default value of BT enemy ranged. All right, so now we have a variable that we can put in the tree that we want per enemy pawn or enemy actor. Now in our AI controller, let's actually cast to our VP enemy base, because we know that the enemy base has a variable for our behavior tree. And then let's get this variable, get behavior tree, and plug it in here. Excellent. Actually, before we do that, it's good to right-click and convert to validated get to make sure that it is valid. All right. And let's just tidy this up a bit. All right. And if it is not valid, let's just print something here saying like no valid behavior tree in enemy actor. So if you see this print statement, that means you forgot to add your behavior tree variable. All right, so now we're running a custom behavior tree per enemy class, and you can validate that by going here, pressing play, and then if I do the apostrophe key to open up the AI debugger, I can see here that we're running a behavior tree called BT enemy ranged. Excellent. So now we have a ranged enemy and melee enemy, and both can run their own separate behavior trees. The next step is actually to edit the behavior tree of the ranged enemy to make it different from the melee and give them range-specific behaviors. But this tutorial is already taking a long time, so I'm going to focus the ranged behavior tree part for the next video, which I'm going to upload very shortly because, yeah, I've already recorded everything. So, see you.